After the lawyer read the will out loud, the first thing my brother did was reach across the table and try to take my phone. Like he could delete the recording just by snatching the device out of my hand. My name is Eleanor, I'm 36, and until 11 days ago I managed risk assessments for a private wealth firm on Bay Street. I know how to read a balance sheet the way some people read faces. I can look at a column of numbers and tell you exactly where someone is lying. That skill is the only reason I'm alive to tell you this story, and the only reason my grandfather's cottage on Lake Joseph still belongs to me. My grandparents, Walter and June, died 19 days ago when their seaplane went down over the Muskoka backcountry on the way back from their anniversary trip to Georgian Bay. The investigators called it engine failure. I called it convenient, but I didn't say that out loud at the funeral, because saying things out loud before you have proof is how you lose. The funeral was on a Tuesday. By Thursday, my family was standing in my grandfather's living room with eviction paperwork. If you've ever watched people who are supposed to love you turn into strangers the second money enters the room, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, because I promise you, you are not the only one. And if you stay until the end of this, you'll understand exactly what one quiet phone call to the right person in this country can do to people who think the law only protects them. I was 33 years old, sitting alone in my grandfather's great room at Birchwood Point, staring at the stone fireplace he built himself with his bare hands back in 1979, when the front door banged open hard enough to rattle the windows facing the lake. My older brother, Reginald, stormed in first, his Canada Goose jacket still zipped up like he'd come straight from a meeting instead of from grieving. Behind him came my younger sister, Camille, and her husband, Dorian, a corporate restructuring lawyer out of a downtown Toronto firm, who wore his Patek Philippe the way other men wear a wedding ring, like a statement he needed everyone to read. They weren't wearing black anymore. 3 days after we buried our grandparents, and they'd already changed out of mourning clothes into the kind of crisp, expensive casual wear you wear to a closing. Reginald walked straight up to where I was sitting and slapped the side table, knocking over Grandpa's reading glasses. "Time's up for playing house, Eleanor," he said. "Pack your things. I want you out of this cottage before the long weekend." Dorian dropped a leather folio on the coffee table hard enough to crack the glass of June's old porcelain teacup. Hot tea spilled across the wood. He didn't even flinch. He just straightened his cuffs. "Let me make this simple for you," Dorian said in that flat, condescending courtroom voice. "This is an emergency possession order, filed and stamped by a Superior Court judge 2 hours ago. Under the temporary administration clauses, Reginald has been named interim executor of the Hendricks estate. This property has already been pledged as collateral against a corporate line of credit. You have no standing here, none." I looked down at the red court stamp on the paperwork. My entire career was built on spotting things that don't add up, and nothing about this added up. You don't get a Superior Court judge to sign off on an emergency possession order and register a $4 million lakefront property as corporate collateral 3 days after a double funeral. That kind of filing takes weeks of preparation, months even, which meant whatever this was, it had started long before my grandparents' plane ever went down. Camille crossed her arms, looking me up and down with open disgust. "God, you look pathetic sitting there in Grandpa's old sweater," she said. "You really think you belong in a $4 million cottage, Eleanor? You've never belonged here. Mom and Dad poured money into Reginald's brokerage because he's the one who actually does something with his life. You're an actuary. You count risk for other people's money for a living. That's not an inheritance, that's a hobby." I didn't answer her. My family had quietly written me off the moment I refused to co-sign one of Reginald's leveraged investment schemes 4 years ago. I'd watched them throw 6 figures at his failing brokerage while I worked 2 jobs through my CFA designation. My silence only made Reginald angrier. He kicked the broken teacup pieces across the rug. "You don't get to sit there in silence like you're better than us," he shouted, close enough that I could smell the scotch already on his breath at 11 in the morning. "You have zero claim to this estate. Sign the transfer agreement right now and walk out that door with your dignity intact, or I will have the sheriff's office walk you out without it." He pulled a heavy fountain pen from his jacket and slammed it onto the documents. I kept my eyes on his face instead of the pen. My training had taught me to read people under pressure, and Reginald wasn't acting like a man who'd just inherited a fortune. He was acting like a man running out of road. That's when I heard the soft click of heels on the hardwood behind us. My mother, Marisol, came out of the hallway, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She'd clearly been waiting in the wings, letting the men play the heavies before she swept in to play the grieving matriarch. "Eleanor, please, listen to your brother," she said, sitting beside me on the leather sofa, taking my hand in both of hers. Her grip felt cold, rigid, like a vice dressed up as comfort. "You've always been so stubborn. Reginald's firm is in serious trouble. If we don't liquidate this property fast, we lose everything. The membership at the club, the house in Oakville, all of it. Be a good daughter, Eleanor. This family needs you to sacrifice for once." I looked down at her manicured fingers wrapped around mine and felt something's inside me finish dying. She wasn't mourning her own father, who had built this entire fortune from a single hardware store in Bracebridge. She was mourning the possibility of losing her social standing. To her, I was an insurance policy to be cashed in the moment her favorite child made a mistake. I pulled my hand away slowly. While my mother composed herself, I noticed Reginald pull Dorian toward the bay window overlooking the lake. They thought they were far enough away. The vaulted pine ceilings carried every word straight to me. "We need her signature today," Dorian hissed. "The Cayman accounts are bone dry, Reg. If we can't show the auditors a $4 million asset injection by end of quarter, OSC is going to open a formal inquiry into the fund." Reginald ran his shaking hands through his hair. I know. But the fund's down 40%. If this cottage doesn't clear escrow by Friday, we're not just bankrupt, Dorian. We're looking at fraud charges. I cannot go to prison." I sat perfectly still, absorbing every word. This was never about sibling rivalry over a vacation property. Reginald and Dorian had been quietly draining the family trust for years, and the federal regulators were closing in. My grandfather's lake house was their last desperate move to plug a hole that was about to swallow them whole. "Eleanor, are you even listening to me?" my mother snapped, the sweetness draining instantly from her voice. "Sign the papers, stop being so selfish." I stood up slowly, looking down at all of them. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I picked up the possession order off the coffee table, walked to the stone fireplace, and dropped it straight into the fire. The room went absolutely silent. The paper curled black and disappeared. "Are you out of your mind?" Reginald roared, lunging forward until Dorian grabbed his arm. "You stupid, arrogant failure," Camille shrieked. "You think burning a piece of paper changes anything?" Dorian growled. "I have digital copies, I have the sheriff's office on speed dial, and tomorrow at 9, this house is mine." I looked at all four of them and said very quietly, "I'm not going anywhere. This cottage belongs to me. And if I were any of you, I'd stop worrying about evicting me and start worrying about what happens when the sun comes up tomorrow." I walked past them and went upstairs, leaving them to scream at each other in the great room. I could hear Reginald kicking furniture as their cars finally tore out of the gravel drive, gone for the night. They had no idea I knew about the safe in my grandfather's boathouse workshop. They had no idea what he'd left behind for exactly this moment. I waited until the old mantel clock chimed 1 in the morning before I changed into a black sweater and went down to the boathouse. My grandfather, Walter, had spent 30 years restoring antique wooden boats, but the workshop's true purpose had always been something else. Behind a panel of his old marine tools sat a flush steel door with a biometric scanner, retina and thumbprint. He'd installed it 3 years earlier, and he'd never given my mother's prints, never registered Reginald or Camille. Only mine, because I was the only Hendricks grandchild who had never once asked him for money. Inside, there was no cash, no jewelry, just a leather dossier and an encrypted external drive with 2 words embossed on the cover, Project North Star. I carried it up to his study, locked the door, and plugged the drive into my laptop. The password prompt came up. I typed in the serial number stamped on his old wristwatch, the one that had survived the crash with him still strapped to it, and the folders unlocked. The first file was titled Internal Audit. My grandfather had quietly hired a forensic accounting firm out of Toronto to trace every dollar moving through the family trust for 2 years. What I found made my stomach drop. Dorian had set up 6 numbered shell accounts through a corresponding bank in the Caymans, forging Walter's signature on loan documents and funneling family trust money straight into Reginald's hedge positions. Reginald had lost nearly $6 million chasing a leveraged oil and gas play that collapsed in under 4 months. The Ontario Securities Commission was already circling. A warning letter sat in the folder dated 3 weeks before the crash. They needed this cottage to cover the hole before the auditors found it empty. Then I opened the leather dossier and found wire confirmations bearing Dorian's signature, moving stolen funds into his own personal account in downtown Toronto. He hadn't just helped Reginald hide a disaster. He'd been robbing his own brother-in-law the entire time while pretending to save him. I checked my watch. 2 in the morning, 7 hours before they came back, plenty of time. Inside the dossier was a thick cardstock envelope. Inside it, a black card with a 10-digit number embossed in silver, no name attached, just a handwritten note on the back in my grandfather's careful print. Office of the Director, Financial Crimes, RCMP. Use only when the wolves come back. I called the number. It connected on the first ring, no dial tone, just a sharp click and a man's graveled voice asking for my clearance code. Walter Hendricks, Irrevocable Trust, Priority Access. Eleanor. There was a pause, the sound of typing. Mrs. Hendricks, your grandfather told us we'd be hearing from you eventually. We've had eyes on the Wilson Bay Holdings accounts for 14 months, waiting for somebody to make a fatal mistake. Tell me they made it. They handed me their own warrant, I said. By 8:45 that morning, the gravel driveway at Birchwood Point exploded with noise. 2 black SUVs and a moving truck tore through the gate, parking across my grandmother's perennial beds without slowing down. Dorian got out first, adjusting his tie, briefcase in hand like a weapon. Reginald followed, manic with the kind of energy that comes from a man who thinks he's just escaped a guillotine. Camille climbed out next, iced coffee in hand, filming on her phone for whoever was watching her stories. Finally, my mother stepped out, oversized sunglasses, fur-trimmed coat, looking every bit the matriarch, ready to reclaim her throne. 4 men in tactical gear stepped out of the truck. Private contractors hired not to move boxes but to drag me out of the house in front of cameras if I resisted. Go in there and get her out, Reginald barked at the lead contractor. I don't care if she screams. Break the door if you have to. I watched all of it through the tinted glass of the foyer, my pulse steady at 60 beats a minute. I felt nothing but cold, clinical calm. The lead contractor reached for the brass handle of the front door. Before his fingers touched it, I turned the deadbolt and pulled it open myself, stepping out onto the porch with my grandfather's coffee mug in hand. I took a slow sip and looked down at all of them. Time's up, Eleanor, Dorian shouted, waving the fraudulent order in the air. Grab her. I lowered my mug. I'd strongly recommend your hired help step back, I said, my voice carrying clean across the cold morning air, because if any one of them sets foot on this porch, they'll be committing a federal offense on a property under active investigation. And unlike your fake court order, the people in the tree line have actual jurisdiction. Dorian laughed, sharp and mocking. Federal offense? Are you completely delusional? There's no one in those woods. The heavy door behind me swung open. A tall man in a tactical vest stepped out, the words RCMP printed in bold yellow across his chest, a gold and blue badge gleaming on his belt. I'd suggest you keep your hands to yourself, son, he said, unless you'd like to add assault on a protected witness to what's coming next. At that, the tree line came alive. A dozen officers in tactical gear stepped out from behind the cedars, from the dock, from the corners of the porch, rifles raised, red dots settling on Reginald's chest and on Dorian's silk tie. The hired contractors didn't hesitate. They dropped their batons and put their hands up before anyone said another word. Dorian's face went the color of ash. Now hold on a second, he stammered. I'm a licensed solicitor. This is a court-ordered eviction. You have no jurisdiction here. The officer didn't even glance at his paperwork. You're trespassing on federal ground, counselor. I took another sip of coffee. Your possession order is invalid, Dorian. You leveraged this property as corporate collateral. But you missed one detail. My grandfather never put this cottage into the corporate portfolio. He placed it into an irrevocable family trust that bypasses the board entirely and names me as sole beneficiary. Ownership transferred into my name 48 hours ago. That's a lie, Reginald shouted, his eyes darting between me and the red laser dot on his chest. You're just an actuary. You can't own this. She is the sole legal owner of this property, the officer confirmed. And as of 2 o'clock this morning, Eleanor Hendricks is under federal protection as a primary cooperating witness in an ongoing fraud and proceeds of crime investigation. By stepping onto this property and attempting to remove her by force, every one of you has just committed a serious indictable offense. Dorian's folder slipped out of his hand, papers scattering across the wet gravel. He'd brought a fraudulent piece of paper to a federal operation, and there was no talking his way out. My mother stumbled forward, her grand matriarch posture gone. Eleanor, please, tell them to put the weapons down. We're family. This is just a misunderstanding. There's nothing left to misunderstand, Mother, I said. Yesterday you told me to be a good daughter and sacrifice everything to cover Reginald's mistakes. Today the law agrees with me instead of you. As I said it, 4 more unmarked vehicles came through the gate, boxing in their cars. CRA officers stepped out, carrying sealed cases. Dorian staggered back, watching the color drain entirely out of his own future. You really thought a $6 million hole could be papered over by stealing a cottage? I asked, stepping down to the first stair. You thought you could run shell accounts through Wilson Bay without triggering a RCMP financial crimes review? My grandfather had forensic accountants on you 2 years ago, Dorian. I spent last night going through every wire transfer. Reginald clutched his chest like he was having a heart attack. You can't do this. I'm the acting head of the family business. You have nothing, Reginald, I said. As of 6 this morning, every account tied to your name and Dorian's has been frozen under a proceeds of crime order. Camille shrieked, swiping frantically at her phone. My cards are declining. Mom, do something. A female officer pointed at the Range Rover parked on the ruined lawn. Hand over the keys, ma'am. That vehicle was purchased with stolen funds. It's now subject to seizure. Camille threw a full tantrum on the lawn while my mother grabbed her coat collar with shaking hands. Eleanor, please, we'll lose the membership, the house, everything. You're not destitute, Mother, I said. You're finally experiencing the reality you wanted to force on me. But the financial reckoning was only the opening act. The door behind me opened again, and the federal prosecutor I'd spoken to at 2 a.m. stepped out beside me. A tall woman with silver-streaked hair in a navy suit. Wire fraud and breach of trust carry serious federal sentences, she said. But that's not why a tactical unit was deployed to this property today. She looked directly at Reginald and Dorian. Flight 119. Reginald let out a strangled sob and dropped to his knees in the gravel. I found the offshore ledger, Dorian, I said. I found the $200,000 wire you sent to the maintenance crew servicing my grandfather's seaplane 48 hours before the crash. A silence fell over the entire driveway. You didn't just steal from this family, I said. You murdered our grandparents to buy yourselves time. My mother screamed, hands clamped over her mouth. The officers moved in, cuffing Dorian against the side of his own SUV, hauling Reginald up off the gravel by his collar while he sobbed and begged my mother to save him. She couldn't. The convoy left, kicking up dust over my grandparents' driveway, taking Reginald and Dorian away to a maximum security holding facility outside Toronto. My mother and Camille were left stranded on the ruined lawn, no car, no phones, the cold lake wind cutting through their designer coats. My mother forced her face into a trembling motherly mask and started toward the porch. The officer beside me moved to block her path. I raised a hand to let her speak. Eleanor, my sweet girl, she began, voice shaking with manufactured grief. I had no idea. I was blinded by them too. We're both victims here. We're Hendricks women. We need to stick together. Let us come inside by the fire and we'll manage this as a family. I felt nothing but disgust. She hadn't shed a single real tear for her own father. You're not a victim, Mother, I said. You're an enabler who chose the illusion of money over your own daughter. Don't insult me by pretending you want to grieve together. You miss the club. You miss the credit line the federal government just froze. Camille whined about the cold, about her phone, demanding I let them in to use the Wi-Fi. Actually, Camille, I can leave you both right there, I said. It's a 6-kilometer walk to the highway. I'd start now if I were you. My mother pounded on the glass door after I'd locked them out, screaming about a mental breakdown, about getting me help whether I liked it or not. I recognized exactly what that was, the groundwork for an involuntary committal, a tactic wealthy families use in this country to strip relatives of their legal autonomy under the guise of concern. I didn't open the door. Instead, I walked to the smart panel my grandfather installed for backyard parties and activated the outdoor speakers. I'd found something else on that drive the night before, a recorded phone call, 3 weeks old, between my mother and a probate lawyer in downtown Toronto. Eleanor's been isolated for years, barely speaks to the family, my mother's voice said through the speakers. If we file for an emergency guardianship, can we have her assessed? A smooth male voice answered, with the right paperwork, the right psychiatrist, we can get a finding of incapacity. Once you hold power of attorney, you control every trust in her name. Then Camille's voice, chiming in eagerly, then we liquidate the cottage, get her declared incapable, and split the proceeds before Reginald's auditors come knocking. The recording ended. Out on the porch, my mother and sister froze, the loving act vanishing in an instant. "You ungrateful little wretch," my mother shrieked, slamming her palms against the glass. "That money belongs to this family. You've never been one of us." I closed the door, drove the deadbolt home, and walked away from their screaming, into the quiet of the home that was finally fully mine. 3 days later, Reginald and Dorian sitting in federal custody waiting on bail hearings, I traded the quiet of the lake for a private dining room at the National Club downtown. Sitting across from me was a senior specialist from a Toronto auction house, reviewing the authentication papers for what I'd found in a storage unit my grandfather had quietly kept under a numbered company in Gravenhurst. 3 immaculate 1967 Jaguar E-types, untouched since the day he bought them. "These are extraordinary," the specialist said. "Provenance is airtight. I can guarantee well above $2 million each at our spring sale." I had just agreed to bypass the reserve price when the heavy doors of the dining room banged open. My mother and Camille barged in, looking unraveled, their polish completely gone. Behind them trailed a nervous man in a cheap suit, clutching a manila envelope. "Eleanor, my poor sick girl," my mother announced, loud enough for the whole club to hear, hand pressed dramatically to her forehead. "This has to stop. You need help." The process server stepped up and dropped the envelope on the table. "Eleanor Hendricks, you've been served." I opened it calmly. A petition for guardianship of property and person, exactly as I'd anticipated, drafted by the same probate lawyer whose voice I'd already played for an entire driveway full of federal officers. "My apologies for the disturbance," I told the auctioneer. "Wealth tends to produce a very particular kind of theater once the funds run dry." "You cannot ignore this," my mother snapped. "The court has been petitioned. Everything you own goes under my control until you're rehabilitated." I smiled, cold and even. "Did you really think I played that recording for entertainment, Mother?" "That lawyer was picked up by the RCMP at 6 this morning. He's currently telling them everything about your plan to have a sane woman declared incapable for financial gain. This petition isn't a legal document. It's a signed confession." The process server bolted out of the room. Club security arrived within the minute, escorting my mother and sister out by the arms while my mother shrieked about belonging there. I turned back to the auctioneer like nothing had happened and finished the sale. But I knew my mother wouldn't stop. She was a cornered animal, and cornered animals find new lawyers. So I went straight to the offices of Adaze Whitfield, one of the most ruthless estate litigators in the city, a woman who didn't believe in playing defense. "They'll keep coming," I told her. "I need to be bulletproof before this reaches a courtroom." "Then we make you bulletproof," she said, and handed me a list of 3 forensic psychiatrists. Over the next 2 days, I sat through hours of cognitive and behavioral assessment, answering every question with the same precision I brought to a risk model. All 3 came back unanimous: exceptional cognitive function, superior emotional regulation under extreme stress. I was, taper, the sanest person in my entire family. Adaze also pulled the banking trail on the storage unit deed. The $180,000 I'd used to secure it years earlier had come from my grandmother June's life insurance payout. Money explicitly designated for my education and housing. Buried in the ledger was a flagged transaction from 7 years prior, an attempted wire of the entire amount out of my account, routed straight to a holding company controlled by my mother and Reginald. They had tried to steal that money out from under me while I was working nights to pay my own tuition. I'd caught it, locked my accounts, and used the secured funds to buy that storage property to keep it safe from them. Every car inside it was mine, free and clear, and the records proved my mother had a documented history of trying to defraud her own daughter. "Compile it all," I told Daisy. "Medical, financial, everything. File it with the court." While that was underway, my mother turned her remaining venom on the easiest target left, my younger sister Priya. Quiet, careful, the one who'd spent her whole life trying to stay invisible in our family. She'd married Desmond, a structural engineer who ran his own consultancy out of Ottawa, a thoughtful, steady man who'd absorbed years of my mother's condescension about his profession and his background without ever fighting back, purely for Priya's sake. In the study of her rented Rosedale townhouse, my mother shoved a fabricated affidavit across the desk to Priya, demanding she sign a sworn statement claiming I'd suffered manic episodes my entire life. "Sign it," my mother hissed. "Your brother is sitting in a federal cell. We need a unified family front for the judge." Priya's hands trembled over the pen. "But it's a lie, Mom. Eleanor isn't crazy. Reginald did terrible things. I can't lie to a judge." My mother slammed her glass down. "You ungrateful girl, he's your brother. Blood matters." Sign it or I cut you out of this family forever." The study door opened. Desmond had been listening in the hallway the whole time, and without raising his voice, he stepped in, pulled out his phone, and started recording. "Priya isn't signing anything," he said. "You're asking her to commit perjury to protect a man who helped have her grandparents killed. That ends now." My mother rounded on him. "This is family business. You're just the husband. Your family business is currently being dismantled by the RCMP and CRA, Desmond replied evenly. "You're not protecting a legacy, you're trying to drag Priya down with you." When my mother realized she was losing her grip, she turned vicious. "If you walk out that door, I will end you," she snapped at Desmond. "I still know people on the planning committee. I'll see to it your firm never gets another municipal contract in this province." It was exactly the threat Desmond had been waiting to capture. He confirmed the recording was still running, told my mother precisely what she'd just done, coerced a witness and threatened extortion on tape, and walked Priya out the door, away from that house for good. That evening I got a text from Desmond with an encrypted audio file attached. "Priya's safe. We're out. Use this to bury her." I called him in for a meeting at a Diazy's office the next morning. He looked exhausted but resolute. "There's something else," he said, sliding a small encrypted drive across the table. 2 months ago at a family dinner, Reginald left his laptop open in the study. I went in to grab Priya's coat and saw a dark web forum still loaded on the screen. I photographed everything. The images, projected onto the office monitor, showed offshore crypto wallets tied to an illegal online sportsbook operating out of Eastern Europe, the kind that exists specifically to launder and collect debts the legal system can't touch. The final photo showed a direct message from an enforcer. Reginald owed $300,000 in personal gambling losses, due in full within the month, or they'd send someone to collect in person. "He's not just facing fraud charges," Adaze said grimly, studying the screen. "Your mother knows exactly what happens if that debt isn't paid, even with him in custody. This guardianship petition isn't about saving face anymore. It's a ransom attempt. She needs clean, untraceable cash, fast, and she's trying to take it from you." 3 weeks later, I sat beside a Diazy at the respondent's table in Toronto courtroom, wearing a charcoal suit, my posture iron. My mother sat across the aisle in a modest beige dress, every trace of her usual polish gone, with a new lawyer, her previous one currently in custody for witness tampering. Her new counsel, a nervous man named Whitfield, no relation to Adaze, opened with a meticulously rehearsed story about my manic episode, about me isolating my family with paranoid delusions about federal agents in the woods, and pointed to my purchase of a worthless storage shed up north as proof I was hemorrhaging money irrationally. He had no idea that shed held 3 Jaguars worth $6 million combined. When my mother took the stand, she cried beautifully, real tears for the cameras of a courtroom that didn't have any, swearing she only wanted to get me help, that she didn't care about the money. Adaze let her finish every word before standing. "Your Honor, opposing counsel has delivered a compelling performance," Adaze said, "but this court doesn't rule on performances, it rules on evidence." She submitted the 3 psychiatric evaluations, each one demolishing the claim of incapacity in clinical, unambiguous language. Whitfield objected weakly and was overruled instantly. Then Adaze pulled up the banking ledger on the courtroom screen. The life insurance payout, the blocked wire 7 years earlier, routed straight to a holding company controlled by my mother and Reginald. "This wasn't manic spending, Your Honor. This was my client defending her own inheritance from an attempted theft by her mother and brother 7 years before this hearing ever began." My mother gasped audibly. The judge's expression hardened into stone. "This petition," Adaze concluded, "isn't an act of maternal concern. It's the continuation of a documented pattern of financial abuse. The petitioner failed to take her daughter's money 7 years ago. Today she's attempting to use this court to finish the job." The judge dismissed the petition outright, and before he could close the hearing, Adaze raised a hand. "There's one more matter, Your Honor. I'd like to call a witness." Across the aisle, my mother's head snapped around as Desmond walked down the aisle, swore the oath and laid out everything. The coerced affidavit, the threats against his firm, the recorded confession, and finally, the photographs of the offshore gambling debt that explained exactly why my mother needed cash so desperately, so fast. The judge's face went gray with fury. "Extorting a witness to secure a fraudulent finding of incapacity is one of the most serious abuses of this court I have encountered in 30 years on the bench," he said. He dismissed the petition with prejudice, barred my mother from ever filing again in that jurisdiction, ordered her to cover every cent of my legal costs through seizure of her remaining assets, and forwarded the gambling evidence directly to the RCMP's Organized Crime Unit for further investigation into Reginald's debts. My mother collapsed in her chair as the bailiff moved in. She didn't fight it. There was nothing left in her to fight with. "Mrs. Hendricks," the judge said quietly, looking at me, "you've endured a profound betrayal from the people meant to protect you. You're free to go." A year passed. I stood in the glass-walled gallery of the Heritage Auto Museum I'd built on the storage property up north, the one my mother's lawyer had once called worthless. One of the original Jaguars sat on a rotating platform under soft light, the centerpiece of a facility that now drew collectors from across the country. A copy of a National Business Centers magazine sat on the reception desk, my face on the cover under the headline "The Risk Analyst Who Took Down Her Own Family's Empire." My head of security flagged a situation at the gate. On the monitor, I barely recognized the two figures standing there. My mother in a thrift shop coat, her dyed hair grown out gray at the roots. My father, Lawrence, beside her, gaunt, his suit hanging off a frame that had clearly gone without proper meals for a while. Reginald was serving a life sentence without parole for his role in the deaths of our grandparents. Dorian had taken a plea deal to testify against him and was doing 15 years of his own. Camille had vanished with some promoter she'd met in Montreal and changed her number months ago. I let them through the gate and stood outside under a gray Ontario sky. My mother dropped to her knees on the cold pavement. "Eleanor, we have nothing left," she said, voice breaking. "We're in a basement apartment in Scarborough. We're eating from the food bank. You have everything, please. We're your family." I looked at her for a long moment. There was no anger left in me, no satisfaction either, just a clean, total absence of feeling. "Blood doesn't commit perjury against its own," I said. "Blood doesn't try to have a sane woman declared incapable to pay off a gambling debt. You made your choices, and I'm not your family anymore. You're trespassing." I had security walk them back to the gate, and I watched it close behind them, the sound of the latch final and complete. Then I turned and walked back inside, past the Jaguar rotating slowly under the lights, into the private lounge where Priya and Desmond were waiting with a bottle of good Niagara sparkling wine, ready to celebrate the launch of a new fund I was setting up in my grandparents' names. One built to help women rebuild after exactly this kind of betrayal. I raised my glass and looked out over everything my grandfather had left behind, everything they'd tried to take, everything I'd kept. The hardest lesson my family ever taught me is that walking away from people who only see you as something to exploit isn't cruelty. It's the first real act of self-respect you'll ever get to make, and once you make it, nothing they say standing outside your gate can ever touch you again.